For a lot of Americans, normal life is starting to feel weirdly out of reach. In some cities, even people with good jobs feel stuck. Housing is expensive, traffic is exhausting, and everyday life feels more stressful than stable. But the interesting thing is this: it didn't happen everywhere. Quietly, across parts of the country, there are still cities where middle-class life actually feels possible, where people can still buy a decent house, raise a family, and live without feeling financially cornered all the time. They're usually not the cities dominating headlines, and many people outside their region barely talk about them. But in 2026, these places are becoming more valuable than ever. Today, we're looking at 10 of them. Not just housing prices, we're talking taxes, commutes, weather, and the kind of ordinary moments that actually make a place feel like home. Fort Wayne, Indiana. Fort Wayne is the kind of city most Americans barely think about, and honestly, that might be part of why it still works. There's no luxury boom here, no nonstop traffic, no feeling that normal people are being quietly priced out every few years. The city rebuilt itself around healthcare, logistics, and defense manufacturing after the old factory economy faded, and that foundation is held up in ways that matter for everyday life. You still feel the old industrial Midwest here, but not in a collapsing way, more in a people stayed and figured it out kind of way. And financially, life here still feels manageable. Indiana keeps taxes relatively reasonable compared to a lot of neighboring Midwestern states. Property taxes aren't out of control, and the overall cost of living still allows many middle-class families to own an actual house without feeling permanently stretched thin. The pace of life also feels different here. You can drive across town without planning your day around traffic. On Friday nights, high school football fields fill with families wearing school colors like they've been doing it forever. Local diners stay busy on weekend mornings with regulars who all seem to know at least one waitress by name. Fort Wayne still carries traces of the old Rust Belt in a way that feels grounded rather than depressing. Older brick neighborhoods, Union-era houses, parish churches sitting quietly between residential streets, it feels like a place where working and middle-class families were once the center of the city, and in many ways still are. The River Greenway Trail system winds for miles along the St. Mary's and St. Joseph rivers, and unlike in some cities, people actually use it. Cyclists, retirees, parents walking dogs on a Tuesday afternoon. The weekend rhythm here has texture. Farmers markets, local coffee shops, neighborhood restaurants, minor league baseball in the summer. Not because the city is trendy, but because people genuinely live here. The trade-off, of course, is winter. By February, the sky has a color that barely feels real anymore. But the upside is 4 actual seasons, including summers that still feel calm enough to enjoy instead of something you have to escape from. Fort Wayne isn't exciting in the traditional sense, but in 2026, a lot of Americans are no longer searching for exciting. They're searching for manageable, and Fort Wayne quietly delivers that better than most cities its size. Des Moines, Iowa. If you landed in Des Moines without knowing where you were, you'd probably notice something unusual almost immediately. Everything feels oddly functional. The roads are clean, traffic moves, neighborhoods feel maintained instead of constantly turning over. Des Moines quietly became one of the stronger job markets in the Midwest, in finance, insurance, healthcare, and corporate services. Companies like Principal Financial and Wells Fargo have large operations here, which gives the city a professional middle class that's larger than people expect for a place this size. Iowa has also been steadily lowering its income taxes over the last few years, and for families coming from higher tax states, the difference becomes noticeable pretty quickly. It is not a zero-tax state, but everyday life here still tends to feel financially lighter than in many larger metros. But what really separates Des Moines from a lot of bigger cities is the pressure level. People here still do ordinary things without it feeling financially impossible. Families go out to dinner without treating it like a budget calculation. Many people still own homes with yards. Commutes are short enough that your day doesn't begin and end in traffic. The downtown farmers market on Saturday mornings is one of the largest in the Midwest, and it feels less like a tourist event and more like part of the city's weekly rhythm. It takes over 6 blocks near Court Avenue from spring through fall, and the crowd it draws says something real about a city where people are settled enough to have routines. In the evenings, the Court Avenue district has the kind of neighborhood energy that develops when locals actually stay instead of constantly moving on. Winter here is cold and unapologetically Midwestern, the kind of cold that reminds you Iowa sits in the middle of the continent with nothing blocking the wind. But summers are warm, green, and genuinely enjoyable, and the stretch between late spring and early fall has the kind of calm that makes people remember why so many families built lives across the Midwest in the first place. In a country where life increasingly feels expensive, crowded, and unpredictable, Des Moines feels like one of the few places still operating at a human pace. Rogers, Arkansas. A lot of Americans still hear Arkansas and immediately picture poverty, empty highways, and towns that time forgot. Then they visit Northwest Arkansas and realize they were imagining the wrong state. Rogers sits in one of the fastest growing regions in the country, alongside Bentonville and Fayetteville. But what makes this area interesting is that it doesn't feel chaotic in the way most boom regions do. The growth is real, but life still feels surprisingly livable. A huge reason for that is Walmart. The company's headquarters nearby transformed this entire corner of Arkansas over the last 2 decades. Corporate jobs, suppliers, healthcare investment, outdoor infrastructure, and remote workers all started flowing into the region while much of the country wasn't paying attention. But unlike a lot of fast-growing American cities, Northwest Arkansas still feels grounded. Financially, the math here still works for many middle-class families. Arkansas has state income tax, but the overall cost of living is low enough that people moving from places like Denver, Austin, or the West Coast often feel immediate relief. Housing, groceries, insurance, even everyday things like eating out tend to cost less than people expect. What also makes Rogers feel different is the lifestyle around it. Beaver Lake is close enough that people treat it like part of everyday life instead of a vacation destination. The Ozarks surround the region with hiking trails, forests, and rolling hills that make outdoor life feel normal instead of aspirational. Mountain biking became a huge part of the local culture too. In some neighborhoods, you'll see expensive bikes hanging in garages the same way people in other cities store golf clubs. The region also has a surprisingly strong airport for its size. Northwest Arkansas National Airport keeps adding direct flights, which quietly makes the area feel less isolated than people expect from Arkansas. And even with all the growth, Rogers still has the feeling of a place where people are settling down rather than constantly cycling in and out. Families move here for schools, space, and a slower pace, but also because they think they can realistically build a future here. Summers are warm and humid, and the area is changing fast enough that some longtime locals barely recognize parts of it anymore. But compared to many American boomtowns, Rogers still feels like a place where growth hasn't completely destroyed quality of life. Omaha, Nebraska. There's a certain type of American city that almost never trends online. Nobody makes documentaries about it, nobody moves there to reinvent themselves, and yet millions of Americans quietly build stable, good lives in places exactly like it. Omaha is one of those cities. The economy is surprisingly solid. Finance, insurance, transportation, healthcare, logistics. Berkshire Hathaway is headquartered here, but Omaha doesn't feel like a billionaire city. It still feels middle class. Nebraska has also been lowering its income taxes over the last few years, and while property taxes remain a common complaint among locals, the overall financial picture here is still far more manageable than in many larger American metros. Home prices remain relatively reasonable, and everyday life doesn't constantly feel like a budgeting exercise. People still buy houses here without combining multiple incomes and a cryptocurrency portfolio. Parking isn't treated like a luxury item. You can go out to dinner without mentally calculating whether ordering an appetizer was a financial mistake. The Old Market District has the kind of atmosphere that only develops slowly over time. Cobblestone streets, brick warehouses turned into restaurants and bars, independent businesses that survived long enough to become part of the city's identity. On warm evenings, people walk along the riverfront or sit outside downtown restaurants without seeming in a hurry to get anywhere else. And Omaha still has strong community rhythms that many larger cities slowly lost. Creighton basketball games in winter pull the city together in the way college sports sometimes can. Neighborhoods like Dundee and Benson still have local diners filled with regulars on weekend mornings, the kind of places where people recognize each other without needing introductions. The trade-off is winter. Nebraska sits directly in the path of cold prairie wind, and January can feel relentless. But summers are warm, green, and surprisingly pleasant, and the city has enough parks and tree cover that the warmer months genuinely feel lived in. There's also something emotionally calmer about Omaha compared to many fast-growing American cities. Maybe it's the slower pace, maybe it's the lack of nonstop competition, or maybe it's just that people here don't seem permanently stressed out all the time. In 2026, That's becoming more valuable than people realize. Rochester, Minnesota. Rochester is one of those places that makes more sense the older you get. When people are young, they usually move somewhere for excitement. But after a while, priorities shift, and suddenly people care more about safety, healthcare access, commute times, and whether daily life actually feels sustainable. That's where Rochester quietly becomes one of the most appealing small cities in America. The city is built around the Mayo Clinic, and that shapes everything, not just the economy, but the atmosphere itself. The place feels organized and unusually calm. Roads work. Neighborhoods feel intentional. Because so many doctors, researchers, and medical professionals live here, Rochester has a financially stable and highly educated population that's remarkable for a city this size. Minnesota does have higher state income taxes than many places on this list, and that's something people moving here need to understand up front. But what residents get in return is hard to ignore. Excellent infrastructure, strong public schools, and healthcare access that is genuinely among the best in the world. Whether that trade feels worth it depends on your priorities, but people here tend to feel like they're getting something tangible back for what they pay. What's interesting is that despite all of that, Rochester still doesn't feel overwhelmingly expensive compared to other educated, high-quality American cities. Housing prices have risen, but many middle-class families can still realistically buy a home here. The city also feels genuinely safe. Parents let kids ride bikes through neighborhoods, parks stay active, and people actually use the walking trails instead of just talking about them. The biking culture here is quietly serious. Trails follow the Zumbro River and connect neighborhoods in ways that actually make sense, and people use them year-round, including during winter, which probably tells you something about the kind of people who choose to live in Minnesota voluntarily. Forager Brewery has become one of those places that functions more like a community gathering spot than just a brewery. The downtown farmers market draws a loyal Saturday morning crowd, and overall the city has the feeling of a place where people settle into routines instead of constantly chasing the next thing. Winter is the real trade-off. Rochester gets long, cold Minnesota winters, and by February, even locals start questioning their life decisions a little bit. But spring and summer here are genuinely beautiful, and people who survive winter together tend to develop a real sense of community because of it. For Americans looking for stability, world-class healthcare, and a lower-stress version of life, Rochester feels less like a trendy city and more like a long-term plan. Chattanooga, Tennessee. About 15 years ago, Chattanooga had a problem. A lot of mid-sized American cities know well. People were leaving. Downtown was struggling, industrial areas were fading, and younger residents didn't see much reason to stay. Then the city did something unusual. Instead of chasing casinos or giant luxury developments, Chattanooga invested heavily in internet infrastructure and built one of the fastest municipal broadband systems in the country. And slowly, the city changed. Remote workers started paying attention. Small tech companies arrived, entrepreneurs moved in, downtown filled back up. But what makes Chattanooga interesting is that despite all the growth, it still doesn't feel overly corporate or manufactured. Tennessee also has one of the most attractive tax situations in the country for middle-class families. There is no state income tax, property taxes remain relatively low, and for many people moving from places with heavier tax burdens, the difference becomes noticeable very quickly. A larger share of your paycheck simply stays in your own household, and over time, that changes what daily life feels like financially. The city sits between mountains along the Tennessee River, and life here naturally revolves around that geography. Weekends mean hiking Lookout Mountain or Signal Mountain, kayaking downtown on the river, or biking the Riverwalk Trail that cuts through the center of the city. And Chattanooga has developed the kind of community rhythm that many fast-growing cities struggle to build. On Sunday mornings, the Chattanooga market fills with local produce stands, food vendors, musicians, and families who seem to know half the people there already. The North Shore neighborhood across the walking bridge from downtown has the kind of independent coffee shops, bookstores, and restaurants that feel organic rather than developer planned. The outdoor culture here also feels real. On warm evenings, you'll see people kayaking through downtown or sitting outside breweries like Odd Story after spending the day on nearby trails. It doesn't feel like a city pretending to be outdoorsy for branding purposes. People genuinely live that way here. Of course, the trade-off is heat and humidity. Summers can get heavy, especially in July and August, though the mountain geography keeps it more manageable than deeper southern cities. Winters are mild, and snow is rare enough that people still get excited when it happens. Locals debate whether Chattanooga is becoming too popular, but compared to many American boomtowns, it still feels like a place where growth hasn't completely destroyed quality of life. Spokane, Washington. For years, people moving to the Pacific Northwest mostly focused on Seattle. Then Seattle became so expensive that middle-class families started looking several hours inland and asking a different question. Where can we still afford a normal life? Spokane is where a lot of them landed. Located in eastern Washington near the Idaho border, Spokane feels very different from the coastal image people associate with the state. Less tech-driven, less performative, less crowded. People here talk more about hiking conditions than startup valuations, and that shift in what locals care about tells you almost everything about the personality of the city. Washington also has no state income tax, which becomes a major advantage for people relocating from places like California or Oregon. Combine that with home prices still far below Seattle's, and Spokane starts looking less like a compromise and more like a financially realistic version of the Pacific Northwest lifestyle. And visually, the city surprises people. The Spokane River cuts directly through downtown, crashing through waterfalls in the middle of the city in a way that barely feels real the first time you see it. Older neighborhoods on the South Hill have the kind of tree-lined streets and brick homes that only develop over generations. Mount Spokane sits close enough that people casually go skiing after work in winter like it's a normal weekday activity. The outdoor culture here also feels genuine rather than curated for Instagram. The trail system along the river connects neighborhoods in ways that actually make people spend time outside. People kayak, fish, cycle, and hike because that's simply part of daily life here. And Spokane has neighborhood texture that a lot of fast-growing cities struggle to build. The South Perry district feels settled and local in the best way. Thursday evening markets bring out families, dogs, musicians, and regulars who clearly know each other. Coffee shops operate more like community gathering spaces than remote work offices. The trade-off is winter. Spokane gets more snow and colder stretches than Western Washington, and January can feel long. But the city also gets far more sunshine than Seattle, which surprises a lot of newcomers and makes winter feel more manageable than people expect. In 2026, Spokane represents something many Americans are quietly searching for, a version of the Pacific Northwest that still feels livable, grounded, and financially possible for the middle class. Madison, Wisconsin. Madison doesn't really fit the stereotype people imagine when they think about the Midwest. It's cleaner, more educated, more outdoorsy, and honestly, a little more relaxed than most American cities its size. The city sits between two lakes, and in the warmer months, daily life spills outside. People bike to work, families walk along the waterfront after dinner. The whole city seems to operate at a pace most Americans stopped expecting to find in 2026. The University of Wisconsin is the engine behind a lot of that stability. Research money, healthcare jobs, biotech growth, and a constant flow of educated professionals keep the local economy unusually strong for a city this size. But unlike some fast-growing tech hubs, Madison still feels balanced rather than overwhelmed. The biggest trade-off here is taxes. Wisconsin has higher income taxes than many places on this list, and property taxes are real too. But people living here often feel like they can actually see where the money goes. Public schools are strong, infrastructure is well maintained, parks are genuinely usable, and the university medical system gives the city a level of healthcare access that feels much larger than Madison itself. For families planning long-term, many decide the trade is worth it, but it's definitely the kind of city where you want to run the numbers honestly before moving. What also stands out is how physically alive Madison feels. The Dane County Farmers Market around Capitol Square turns Saturday mornings into a citywide routine instead of a tourist event. Locals shop for groceries, run into neighbors, grab coffee, and stay longer than they planned. During summer, the lake shores almost become extensions of people's homes. Sailboats on Lake Mendota, kayaks on Monona, students stretched out on the grass near the water doing absolutely nothing and somehow making it look intentional. And biking here isn't just recreation. People genuinely use the trails to move through the city year-round, even during freezing weather, that would make most Americans immediately reconsider their life choices. The restaurant and brewery scene also feels deeply local rather than corporate. Places like Great Dane Pub feel woven into the city's identity, while Williamson Street still has the kind of independent restaurants and bars that make a city feel lived in instead of designed. Winter is the real test. Madison gets long, upper Midwest winters that can feel endless by February, but the trade-off is that summer here feels incredible. The lakes, the trails, the patios, the outdoor concerts, warm weekends in Madison feel earned. For Americans looking for a stable, educated, lower stress place to build a life, Madison is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Knoxville, Tennessee. Some cities try very hard to impress people. Knoxville doesn't, and that's part of why so many people end up liking it more than they expected. At first glance, it just feels comfortable. Enough restaurants, enough live music, enough college town energy to keep life interesting, but never the level of chaos you get in places like Nashville or Atlanta. You can still go downtown on a weekend without feeling like you've walked into a movie set built entirely for bachelor parties. The University of Tennessee gives the city its rhythm. Most of the year, Knoxville moves at a manageable pace, but on football Saturdays, everything changes. More than 100,000 people dressed in orange fill Neyland Stadium along the river, and even if you don't care about college football, the atmosphere is hard to ignore. The whole city feels connected by it in a way that's impossible to fake. Tennessee also has one of the most attractive tax situations in the country for middle-class families. There is no state income tax, property taxes stay relatively low, and for people moving from higher tax states, the financial difference becomes noticeable very quickly. Everyday life here simply feels lighter financially than in many cities with similar job markets and quality of life. And then there's the location. The Smoky Mountains are close enough that people don't treat them like a vacation destination. They're just part of normal weekends. Hiking trails, rivers, mountain roads, quiet small towns tucked into the hills. Outdoor life here feels natural rather than aspirational. Downtown Knoxville also has more personality than many people expect. Market Square hosts a year-round farmers market that actually feels built for locals instead of tourists. The Old City neighborhood developed its own identity over time with independent restaurants, neighborhood bars, music venues, and the kind of regular crowd where people recognize each other's dogs at the park nearby. On warm evenings, the Riverwalk fills with people who don't seem in any particular hurry to get somewhere else. Of course, summers are warm and humid, the mountains help a little, but this is still Tennessee. Winters are mild by national standards, and snow is rare enough that people still get excited when it shows up. Traffic has also gotten noticeably worse as more people move in, and longtime locals are quick to tell you the city is changing too fast. But honestly, that might be the clearest sign of how desirable Knoxville has quietly become. Huntsville, Alabama. If you had told most Americans 30 years ago that one of the most successful middle-class cities of the future would be in Alabama, a lot of them probably would have laughed. But Huntsville quietly stopped caring about stereotypes a long time ago. This is one of the few cities in America where high-paying engineering and aerospace jobs still exist in large numbers without requiring coastal housing prices to come with them. NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center is here. So are major defense contractors, research facilities, and thousands of engineers whose salaries are high enough that in most American cities the housing market would already be completely out of reach. But somehow, Huntsville still feels relatively attainable. A huge reason for that is property taxes. Alabama does have state income tax, but Huntsville's property taxes are shockingly low by national standards. In some cases, annual property taxes on a median-priced home can come in under $600 a year. For people moving from places where property taxes alone feel like a second mortgage payment, that number almost doesn't sound real. And yet, Huntsville doesn't feel flashy. That's what surprises people when they visit. The city feels organized, suburban, and strangely calm for a place with this much technical talent and economic momentum. New neighborhoods keep filling with young families. Restaurants stay busy on weeknights, not because tourists are visiting, but because people are actually building long-term lives here. What also makes Huntsville interesting is that the city still feels grounded despite all the growth. Big Spring Park in downtown gives the city a genuine center where office workers eat lunch, families walk in the evenings, and kids chase geese near the water like it's a normal part of everyday life. The Rocket City Trash Pandas, Huntsville's minor league baseball team, became a surprisingly big part of the city's identity too. Summer games at Toyota Field feel less like professional sports entertainment and more like old-fashioned community events where families actually spend time together. And then there's Low Mill, a former cotton mill turned into a massive art space filled with working artists, coffee shops, live music, and small studios. It's the kind of place that gives Huntsville a creative side most outsiders never expect from an aerospace city. The weather also helps. Winters are mild, snow is rare, and the outdoor season lasts much longer than in most cities on this list. Summers are warm and humid, but usually stop short of the brutal heat you get deeper into the south. Of course, Huntsville is changing quickly. Traffic is heavier than it used to be, housing prices are rising, and longtime residents will tell you the city feels very different from 15 years ago. But compared to most American boomtowns, Huntsville still feels unusually stable and grounded. And in 2026, that combination of strong jobs, manageable living costs, and a city that still feels livable is becoming increasingly rare.